I was thinking about growing up, my favorite superhero was Batman. I don't know if you guys had a favorite superhero growing up, but I always thought Batman was cool. And the one of the most iconic things about Batman was that he was super wealthy, right? Like he didn't have any superpowers, but through training and everything else, and through his wealth, he was able to become this great superhero. But I always thought one of the coolest things about Batman was that he had Alfred. Right, because there was times that Batman got into a jam that even he couldn't get himself out of, and all of a sudden Alfred would pull up in the limo and be like, "Master Bruce, please get in," right? And he's like beat up, laying on the ground, like, ugh, rolls into the, and it was just so cool. Alfred, I think, was kind of the unsung hero of the whole Batman series because he was always there whenever Batman was going off the rails. He would be there as his comfort. Whenever Batman was, out fighting crime and got into a pinch, it was always Alfred who would find some way to be able to help him accomplish his purpose. And the thing is that Alfred was the unsung hero because he was the butler, right? He was kind of the servant. He was the one always hanging around, always ready to do whatever was needed to support the person that he was serving. And it's interesting because most kids grow up wanting to be Batman. Not many kids grow up wanting to be Alfred. And that's exactly what Jesus is pointing to whenever he is talking about what true greatness looks like here. Because as we're going to read through in today's passage, his disciples still, even after having been rebuked about this very thing, are still stuck on the idea of being great, of being wealthy, of being well-liked, of having a great reputation, of having all of these different things that are earthly of value, and looking specifically to be great like the Pharisees were great, like the rulers of the Gentiles were great. That's what their idea was. And Jesus, again, tells them, if you want to be great, you have to be a servant. In other words, he's saying, you're trying to be Batman, but I want you to be Alfred. You're trying to be the guy who's the main character. You're trying to be the guy who has all the money and all the cool moves and has everything and everybody's looking at, but really you need to be the Alfred, the guy who's behind the scenes, always supporting, always loving, always ready to do whatever is needed for those that he is called to serve. And that's what we're going to read today. But we start off with an interesting passage here in verse number 32 as we read this. And they were on the road going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking ahead of them. And they were amazed, and those who followed were afraid. And taking the 12 again, he began to tell them what was to happen to him. Now, this is an interesting passage of Scripture to me because if you just read it, we get this picture. Jesus is walking in front of his disciples, and then there's a great crowd following him. And it says that his disciples specifically, they were amazed, and that the crowd was afraid. So why? Like the information that we're giving here is that they're walking and the disciples are amazed and the crowd was afraid. For what purpose? Well, if we go right back to the next section and we're looking for the answer of that, we're not really going to find it. He didn't just perform some great, mighty miracle that everybody was in awe of. In fact, he had just had his interaction with the rich young ruler. And it's not that Jesus had just called down manna from heaven or done some great manifestation or some great sign that was causing people to be amazed or afraid. It's the simple phrase that we read here in verse number 32, going up to Jerusalem. If you remember at this point in Jesus' life, even whenever he would get into the vicinity of Jerusalem, the scribes and the Pharisees and the chief priests would send out their people to go and question him. We read that just a few weeks ago whenever Jesus came to Bethany across the Jordan. He was across the Jordan over there in the same region, and whenever he came to that area, the scribes and the Pharisees sent out people to question him and to test him. At this point, Jesus is a wanted man. The scribes are looking for any opportunity to take him out. The Pharisees are looking for any opportunity to take them out. We're going to read here very shortly that actually the two factions that do not like each other, which are the Sadducees and the Pharisees, are actually going to put aside their differences and begin to work together specifically for the destruction of Jesus. We know that he is not liked by the religious leaders. We know that those in Rome would very well view him as dangerous as they did John the Baptist, and yet Jesus is walking ahead of everyone, strolling to Jerusalem. And it is that act that is making his disciples amazed and those following him afraid. You're going to Jerusalem? Think about a political dissident who is speaking out against power in a country that is completely controlled by a specific force. And they all of a sudden publish on their social media, hey, I'm going to the capital city tomorrow. You guys should join me. That would be a pretty bold move, right? If you were at odds with the American government to put on your Facebook, hey, I'm going to be in Washington tomorrow. You guys should come and hang out. That would be a very bad move for somebody who was trying to dodge the authorities and someone who was trying to stay in a low profile. And yet Jesus, who is hated by the religious authorities, who is feared by those who are in power, he is going and walking boldly to Jerusalem. And that in itself is an amazing picture. This singular figure walking ahead of his followers, knowing full well what awaits him in the capital city, and yet he heads there with purpose, without flinching, making his way towards Jerusalem. And then we read in verse number 33, he's telling his disciples exactly what they can expect whenever they get to Jerusalem. And he said to them, "See, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him over to the Gentiles, and they will mock him and spit on him and flog him and kill him, and after 3 days he will rise." Jesus makes it very clear why he is going to Jerusalem. He makes no bones about it. He says, listen, disciples, you're amazed. Other people, the reason that they're afraid, I'm going to tell you exactly what's going to happen whenever we get to Jerusalem. And this is not the first time. I have this nifty little diagram up here just to remind us of where we've been so far in the book of Mark. But as we look, this is the fourth time now specifically that Jesus has mentioned his resurrection. In Mark 8:31 through 32, he said plainly and began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And he said this to them plainly. They should have got this. He said it to them as boldly and plainly as he possibly could have. And then a chapter later, coming down from the Mount of Transfiguration, they've just seen Jesus in his glory revealed with Moses and with Elijah. And we read this, and as they were coming down the mountain, he charged them not to tell what they had seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. And again, he's telling about his resurrection, that he will rise again. But they didn't understand. It said that they were afraid to ask him what this meant. And then now, just a couple of verses later in Mark chapter 9, verses 30 to 32, it says, "For he was teaching his disciples, saying to them, the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him. And when he is killed, after 3 days, he will rise again." And again, now we come here to Mark chapter 10, verse number 33, and Jesus does it again. There should be no question in the disciples' mind the purpose of the Christ, the mission of Jesus, what he is hoping to accomplish, what God has called him to do, and what they can expect when they come to Jerusalem. And I think that that is amazing. Because Jesus isn't trying to make some kind of shady sales pitch to his disciples, like, hey guys, everything's going to be perfect if you come with me. Listen, guys, everything is just going to be so amazing. You're never going to have any problems or any issues. There's going to be no worries. If you just follow me or if you just do, then you're not going to have to worry at all. And unfortunately, there are many churches and many religions and many things in this world that try to give false hope in that way. They say, if you do this, or if you give money to this, or if you just take care of these few things, or this 5 steps, and if you just do those things, then you don't have to worry. Everything in your life is going to be great. But that is not what Jesus tells his disciples. Jesus did not call his disciples to certain safety, but to imminent peril. He told them that they would be hated and mocked and rejected, and yet he called them to it anyways and reminded them that this calling was far above anything that they could imagine. And I love that, because whenever Jesus calls us, he calls us in the same way. Oftentimes, whenever we read Scripture and we read these amazing accounts of Jesus, we forget that we're his disciples just like those disciples. And he doesn't call us to a perfect life of safety. He doesn't call us to have everything come up roses and unicorns and rainbows, unfortunately. But instead, he calls us to a life that may involve imminent peril. He calls us to a life that may include mockery, that may include rejection, that will certainly include self-sacrifice, and that, as we will see very soon, includes putting others above ourselves and becoming servants instead of seeking after the greatness that the world has to offer. Jesus makes it very clear what his disciples can expect when they come into Jerusalem, but his disciples don't get it. I know you're really surprised at this point that his disciples don't get it. They've got everything up to this point, right? Going through the book of Mark, it's like they haven't missed anything. No, we know that his disciples over and over again miss it, and we're about to see another time where that happens. If you'll read with me now in verse number 35. And James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came up to him and said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." And he said to them, "What do you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Grant us to sit one at your right hand and one at your left in your glory." James and John here literally trying to manipulate God. And of course, we would never do that. We would never try to manipulate God in any way, right? But this is, as again, if you have kids or grandkids or you're around kids, you probably know that this happens sometimes, right? Of like, "Hey, I want to ask you something. Will you do it?" Now, if you're smart, you'll say, "What did you want to ask me? What do you want me to do?" And that's what Jesus does here. He doesn't just say, "Yeah, sure, anything you want, I'm going to take care of it," but instead says, "Hey, what do you want?" It's interesting that James and John start off their conversation with Jesus almost trying to trick him into giving them what they want. But Jesus asks them, "What do you want?" And they come out and they say it very clearly. "We want to be your right and left hand guys. We want to be the greatest in the kingdom. Whenever you're sitting on your throne, we want a little throne to the right-hand side and a little throne to the left-hand side that we can sit on with you." They can even be connected. That'd be cool. It's like kind of a three-seat, like a love seat kind of deal. Like we'll sit one at your right, one at your left hand. We want to be the greatest. We want to have the most authority. We want to be the ones who you look at to make decisions. We want to be your vice regents, the ones with the most power and the most authority. Jesus, we know you're going to Jerusalem. The only possible reason that you could be going to Jerusalem is to kick out the Romans and to kick off your kingdom. So before everybody else gets on this bandwagon, we want to put in our bid. We want to be great. Isn't that interesting that Jesus just told them clearly for the fourth time in 2 chapters that he is going to Jerusalem to be mocked and rejected and spit on and turned over to the Gentiles and killed. And yet, as they walk to Jerusalem, James and John have it in their head. We're going to Jerusalem. This is it. Jesus is going to make himself known. He's going to kick out the Romans. He's going to make us great. And we want to make sure that we're on the bandwagon early. So before anybody else gets it in their head to ask this, let's ask it first. Jesus, make us great. And we see Jesus' response to them. Jesus said, "You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized?" So Jesus here now asks them this question very bluntly. He's saying, "You want to be great? You want to be next to me in my glory? Do you think you're able to endure the suffering that I've literally just expressed to you? I've expressed it now 4 times. I told you that I'm going to be beaten and hated and spit on and handed over to those dirty Gentiles who you still don't have a heart for to be killed. And I'm asking you, can you drink that cup? Can you be baptized with the baptism with which I am going to Jerusalem to endure?" And they still don't get it. And they say, as we read here in verse number 39, and they said to him, "We are able." And Jesus said to him, the cup that I drink, you will drink. And with the baptism which I am baptized, you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those whom it has been prepared. Jesus looks at them and, of course, knowing more than just the situation itself, knows you're not ready right now. But there will come a time when you do drink of that cup of suffering, where you do have that baptism of hatred, where you do have that rejection that comes upon you. You will endure those things. Those things are going to happen, but you don't understand it quite yet. And then he tells them very clearly that to sit at his right hand or his left hand is not his to grant, but it is for those to whom it has been prepared. I think it's also just interesting if we see how Jesus is often described in the Bible as seated at the right hand of the Father. That you want to know who's seated next to Jesus? It's God. That's, if you want to know like the right hand and the left hand of Jesus, like you want to be, no, that's specifically the role of the Trinity that we see there specifically. And so that's what he's saying specifically, is that is for those who it has been prepared for. But anyways, as we look at that, we see specifically that James and John, what they want is greatness. They're expecting Jesus now to be their warrior king, to be the one who goes in and reestablishes Jerusalem. And if he's David, they want to be their Jonathan. If he's Saul, then he wants to be Abner, the leader of the army. They want to be the guys who are the second and third most powerful people in Jesus' kingdom, just right below Jesus. Jesus, you're the ultimate Messiah, but we want to be number 2 and 3. Maybe like 1.5 and 2. Like right here in that area, that's where we want to be. And Jesus has already told them that in order to be there, they must drink of the cup that he drinks and be baptized with the baptism that he is to be baptized with. And so we read in number 41 that after Jesus tells them this, that when the 10 heard it, they began to be indignant at James and John. Yeah, absolutely, right? So why were they indignant? Because they beat them to it, right? They wanted to be the ones. They're like, oh, James and John got there first. They weren't indignant because you guys should never ask that question of Jesus. Like, you're just supposed to follow and serve and do whatever Jesus. No, we know from just the last chapter that all of the disciples were arguing about who would be the greatest. They all were like, hey, I'm going to be greater than you, Peter. I'm going to be telling you to wash my shoes, man. Like, you're going to be the one who's going to have to wash my feet. You're going to be the one who's going to have to clean my room. Like, I'm going to be greater than you. And they're arguing back and forth about who's going to be greater, who's going to have the biggest section of Jerusalem or of Judea or of Israel that they're going to get to rule over, and who will ultimately be the one who is the greatest. And so whenever James and John beat them to the punch, now they're frustrated and they're angry. I wish I would have asked that question first. They are indignant at James and John, and Jesus brings them together now. And he tells them once again the meaning of true greatness. In verse number 42, and Jesus called them to him and said to them, you know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. But it shall not be so among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. So you can imagine this picture, Jesus striding ahead of his disciples on the way to Jerusalem, crowds following them, fearful of what would lay ahead. As they are walking on the way to Jerusalem, he pulls aside his disciples and says, remember what is going to happen. I don't want you to be freaked out whenever it happens, so I'm going to tell you again for the 4th time that the Son of Man is going to be rejected. He is going to be laughed at. He is going to be spit on. He is going to be turned over to the Gentiles. He is going to be killed, but don't worry, because after 3 days, he will rise again. And then they start walking, and as they're walking, James and John kind of break away from the pack, and they're like, hey, Jesus, we're going to Jerusalem to be great, and we want to be the greatest of the great. You got to imagine with all the things that Jesus has running through his mind, with all of the picture of the cross fully in front of him, that this is probably the last thing that he really wants to deal with, is a bunch of guys who are jockeying for position as he's telling them that he is going to die for their sins. And so he brings them all together and he tells them that if they want to be great, they have to be servants. That if they want to be the first, they have to be the last. And even just those words that are used here specifically, that if you want to be great, you must be a servant, and whoever wants to be first among you must be the slave of all. Those aren't terms that we like. Like, think about this. You're walking down the road, somebody in front of you drops a piece of trash. You assume it's on accident, so you walk up behind them and you pick up that piece of trash and you're about to throw it away, and they say, "Yes, servant, throw that away for me." How are you going to react to that? You're going to drop that thing on the ground and be like, "You can pick up your own trash. I'm not your servant. I'm not anybody's servant," right? Like, that's not a word that we want to be associated with mostly. Like, servant, no. Slave, absolutely not. Those are derogatory terms. Those are terms for people who, don't have anything else that they can do with their lives. We think that, a servant, slave, that's even worse. How could that possibly be applied to me? And yet Jesus says that he, the first and the last, the Lamb who was slain from the foundations of the earth, the one who sat forever at the right hand of the Father in glory, that he came down to earth not to be served, but to be a servant. And yet somehow the disciples had it in their mind that to be a servant was beneath them. And somehow we often get it in our minds that to be a servant is beneath us too. We're supposed to be served. We're supposed to be great. We're supposed to be the ones who have our needs met, who have people who are catering to our cares and our desires, but to be a servant, to be someone who is often looked down on or not looked at all, to be someone whose deeds are expected and not requested, to be someone who often gets the short end of the stick, who does not take care of their own needs until the needs of others are met. How could God expect that of us? A servant? A slave? And yet Jesus, the one who created all of the universe, who holds it together, the one who at the end of all time will come to set all things right, the one who is God in flesh, who was there before the beginning of time, before the earth was created, before one single molecule that we recognize in our universe ever came to exist. He was, and he came not to serve, not to be served, but to serve. And so how could we be offended with the title of servant? How could we be offended with the job title of slave? Yet we are, because we often seek our own ways and our own greatness. In this story, we don't reflect Jesus as much as we reflect James and John. Jesus, I want to follow you, but I want to follow you in a way that makes me great. Jesus, I want to follow you, but I want to follow you in a way that makes me comfortable. Jesus, I want to follow you, but I want to follow you into a way where everybody else knows how good I am, or that I'm in charge, or that I have status, or that I have authority. Jesus, I want to follow you, but I want to follow you on my own terms. And Jesus says, no, there's only one set of terms and conditions, and you have to check the box to agree before you can move forward to the page that you want to go to, because that term and that condition is that if you want to be great in the kingdom, you'll be a servant. Because even the Son of Man, Jesus himself, came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. As I was thinking about this, I couldn't help but be drawn to the passage of Isaiah 53. We often read from this passage, and this whole chapter is often called the suffering servant. The picture of the suffering servant, of what the Messiah will look like. And this is the kind of Messiah that all of the Jewish people should have been looking for. And Isaiah 53 is a very special portion of Scripture in my own life because it is the first time that I remember making a commitment to Christ with my life. Whenever I heard my children's pastor reading from the words of Isaiah 53, he was crushed for our transgressions and bruised for our sins. The chastisement of our peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. That was the first time that I remember understanding the gospel of Jesus Christ. But I just want to read Isaiah 53 and think about this being Jesus. This being the man who stood in front of the disciples seeking their own greatness, and yet this was the picture that they looked at. Isaiah 53, starting in verse number 1. Who has believed and who has heard from us, and whom has the arm of the Lord revealed? For he grew up before him like a young plant and a root out of dry ground. And he had no form or majesty that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him. And he was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And as one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, and yet we esteemed him stricken and smitten by God and afflicted. And he was pierced for our transgressions, and he was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and by his wounds we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned everyone to his own way, and the Lord laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed, he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that is silent before his shearers, so he opened not his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. And as for his generation, who considered that he was cut off out of the land of the living, stricken for the transgressions of my people. And they made his grave with the wicked, and with a rich man in his death, although he had done no violence, and there was no deceit in his mouth. Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him, and he has put him to grief. When his soul makes an offering for guilt, he shall see his offspring, he shall prolong his days. The will of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. Out of anguish of his soul he shall see and be satisfied. And by his knowledge shall the righteous one, my servant, make many be accounted righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities. Therefore I will divide him a portion with the many, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out his soul to death, and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sin of many, and makes intercession for the transgressors. It's such a beautiful passage of Scripture. And when we think about this, that this was the Jesus that these men hoped to use for their own greatness. The one who was beaten and accused was counted as a sinner, and though there was no violence in him, he was cast away. Though he was laid in the place of sinners, he was killed next to thieves. And yet all the disciples could think on their trip to Jerusalem is who's going to be the greatest. And whenever we think about Jesus and we see this picture of Jesus, knowing full well more than just these 4 instances of him predicting his death and his resurrection, but that it is now a thing that we see in our rearview mirror as accomplished, that he has indeed risen from the grave and he is now alive and with God. Knowing this to be the case, knowing that he has conquered death and the grave, do we still seek our own greatness? Is it still our desire to make ourselves in the image of what we consider great instead of making ourselves in the image of Christ? the one who Isaiah 53 puts it so well, a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief and with suffering, and yet we spend so much of our lives trying to figure out how we can be more comfortable, how we can have people serve us, how we can be the ones who don't have to go through grief or pain or sorrow or suffering, how we can have the simplest and the most comfortable life possible, and yet we look to Jesus. And he calls us to conform our lives not to our own picture of greatness, not to our own desires, not to our own purpose of being the best or the wealthiest or the most well-known or the most well-respected, but instead calls us to his purpose of being a servant of all, of being the one who, though we suffer for a purpose. That whenever people spit at us and they hate us and they mock us, we love them. That whenever there's somebody that is the absolute hardest for us in the world to love, that we try to find ways to be a servant to that person. That whenever we feel like our rights have been violated by another person, we don't seek to exercise our rights over them, but instead seek to serve them and love them well. That instead of putting ourselves up on the pedestal, that we seek to push others up, that they, at that vantage point, might see the goodness of Christ. We can form our lives into the image of what we think is great, with money and power and esteem and authority and reputation, or we can form our lives into the image of Christ. But we can't do both. And if we form our lives into the image of Christ, then yes, with that may come blessing and riches and things that we could never have possibly imagined. But with that also will come the cup of his suffering and the baptism of his suffering. And so whenever we think about greatness, whenever we think about how we are forming our lives, is our desire to be Batman or is our desire to be Alfred? Are we seeking to be the one who has all the money and makes all the decisions and has all the cool gadgets and has the big light in the sky with his symbol and gets called out? Or are we looking to be the guy who says, Jesus, I want to be a servant. I want to be a servant. And if I die and all I'm ever known as being is a good servant, that is great, because whenever we get to heaven, we're not going to hear, well done, thou good and faithful, famous person. We're not going to hear, well done, thou good and faithful great one. We're not going to hear, well done, thou good and faithful ruler. We will hear the words, well done, good and faithful servant. Servant of Christ, servant of his people, servant of those who are in need. So what does your life look like? What are your goals and your ambitions? How are they serving you, or are they serving others? Is our goal that we might be conformed into the likeness of Christ, even as he is described as a suffering servant? Or is our goal to be as comfortable as possible, to avoid as much suffering as possible, because ultimately our lives are not about others, but our lives are about ourselves? Because we see, as Jesus closes out this section, these beautiful words that many of us know. For even the Son of Man came, not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Would you pray with me?